A dramatically lit, high-detailed composition in the style of classical oil paintings, showing Joan of Arc chained within the grim stone fortress cell in Rouen, the air thick with the palpable decaying stench of human corruption and stale confinement. Her youthful face, rendered pale by exhaustion and illuminated by a single harsh shaft of light, stares defiantly despite the recently shorn hair and the chafing manacles on her wrists, capturing the moment just after her initial coerced abjuration, yet anticipating the imminent diabolical legal trap set by her English captors to destroy her as a relapsed heretic.
Một monumental historical canvas captured in the dramatic detail of classical oil paintings, depicting the oppressive atmosphere of the ecclesiastical court in Rouen, where Joan, standing defiant and unrepresented, parries the subtle, intricate theological traps set by Bishop Couchon and the brilliant, hooded inquisitors. Focus on the contrast between her simple peasant dress and the heavy velvet robes of her accusers, with light dramatically falling upon her face as she counters their dangerous question about grace, demonstrating her intellectual and spiritual superiority amidst the suffocating legal machine designed to ensure her condemnation.
A highly detailed, emotionally resonant depiction in the style of classical oil paintings, centered on the traumatic moment of Joan's coerced abjuration on May 24, 1431, staged dramatically in the public square of St. Ouen Cemetery. The pyre's dry wood is visibly stacked high, intimidating the young woman, who is flanked by the executioner and the ambitious Bishop Couchon, whose face is rendered with cynical satisfaction as Joan, desperately seeking the promise of life imprisonment, signs the brief document, unaware that this very act is the first crucial step in the meticulously constructed final trap of relapsed heresy designed to ensure her fiery execution.
A stark, emotionally charged interior scene, reminiscent of Caravaggio's dramatic lighting in classical oil paintings, depicting Joan of Arc 4 days after her abjuration, confronting the agonizing dilemma within her cell. The discarded, flimsy woman's shift lies on the ground, emphasizing her vulnerability as she reaches for the forbidden tunic and hose, her only true defense against the 5 menacing her fundamental human instinct for self-preservation into irrefutable evidence for her death sentence.
A grand, processional narrative painting, captured with the solemnity and architectural precision of classical oil paintings, illustrating Joan of Arc's final, heavily guarded march through the winding, cobblestone streets of Rouen toward the execution site. The vast escort of 800 English soldiers forms an impenetrable wall around her solitary figure, contrasting the sheer weight of institutional power against her fragile, white-clad frame, while high above the crowded medieval rooftops, the cold gray sky seems to witness the state-sponsored political murder disguised beneath the veneer of meticulous, sophisticated theological jurisprudence. A dramatic agonizing depiction, rendered in the high-contrast chiaroscuro and rich detail of classical oil paintings, focusing on the moment Joan of Arc is chained to the stake in Rouen. The scene is dominated by the newly kindled flames licking at the dry wood below, while the central focus remains on her face, turned upward, pleading with Friar Louiseler to hold the simple, improvised crucifix high above the roaring inferno, ensuring that the image of Christ is the absolute last thing she sees before the smoke and fire consume her. A final, profound testament to the divine mission she refused to permanently disavow.
A powerful, intensely emotional depiction, executed with the vigorous brushwork and heightened realism of classical oil paintings, concentrating on the horrified reaction of the crowd, and specifically the English official who witnesses Joan's death. The acrid smoke and rising flames obscure the stake, but the profound realization dawns on the official, whose face is contorted in shock and spiritual dread as he shouts the chilling prophecy, "We are lost, for we have burned a saint," symbolizing the immediate, irreversible failure of the sophisticated legal mechanism to truly destroy her sanctity and legacy.
A grand, allegorical diptych realized in the heroic, detailed style of classical oil paintings, contrasting the peak of Joan's power, her armored presence illuminating the coronation of Charles VII at Reims in 1429, radiant with undeniable divine favor, with her brutalized reality 2 years later. The opposing panel shows her confined, wearing the humiliating common shift, surrounded by the severe faces of her judges, illustrating the systematic, sophisticated legal process used by the English, not just to defeat a warrior, but to thoroughly assassinate the hope and the foundational idea of God's favor for France.
A highly symbolic and intensely psychological study, painted with the stark contrasts and rich allegory characteristic of classical oil paintings, illustrating the concept of the law as a weapon. Joan of Arc is depicted physically subdued, not by brute force, but by immense scrolls of legal and theological texts that twist around her like chains, while the shadowy figure of Bishop Cauchon presents a quill and document, forcing her signature, a visual metaphor for how the intricate, sophisticated architecture of medieval canon law was ruthlessly exploited to neutralize a saint through coerced confession and engineered self-incrimination.
A deeply mystical and emotionally resonant composition, utilizing the ethereal light and heightened spiritual drama found in classical oil paintings, illustrating the moment Joan of Arc's resolve returns in the Rouen dungeon, just before her final condemnation. She is depicted looking upwards, tears streaming down her face, acknowledging the return of her celestial voices, specifically Saint Michael and Saint Gabriel, who rebuke her for signing the abjuration, a confession of renewed faith and relapsed heresy that she immediately and honestly delivered to her judges, completely unaware that this simple spiritual affirmation was the legal catalyst for her swift, inevitable death sentence.
A somber, wide-angle landscape painting captured in the muted, reflective tones typical of classical oil paintings, depicting the cold, chilling final act of the execution. English soldiers and the executioner stand on the banks of the River Seine, having meticulously burned Joan's remains 3 times over, now carefully sweeping the last fine gray ashes and bone fragments into the flowing river. This desolate scene emphasizes the brutal, calculated political effort to annihilate every physical trace of the martyr, ensuring that no relic could remain for the French populace to venerate and thereby sustain the infectious, dangerous symbol of national hope.
A luminous and authoritative historical depiction realized in the formal composition and detailed drapery of classical oil paintings, symbolizing the triumph of truth during the 1456 rehabilitation trial. The scene features the papal inquisitor, Jean Bréal, surrounded by a multitude of over 115 solemn witnesses, including former judges and guards, who testify under oath, their collected narratives systematically exposing the previous proceedings as a comprehensive legal fraud and political assassination, effectively overturning the verdict and demonstrating that the sophisticated medieval legal machine, used as a weapon, ultimately failed to erase the divine truth of Joan's mission.
A dramatic low-light classical oil painting depicting the 19-year-old Joan of Arc chained within the stone military cell at Rouen, her head recently shaved. The thin, humiliating woman's dress emphasizing her fragility, while a shaft of pale light illuminates the subtle, foul stench of human decomposition that permeates the air, symbolizing the legal decay of her imprisonment and the crushing weight of the English orchestrated betrayal. Captured with meticulous Baroque detail. Classical oil paintings. A monumental classical oil painting reminiscent of Renaissance masters, capturing the claustrophobic intensity of the Rouen trial. Joan of Arc stands defiant yet exhausted, surrounded by 70 stern, black-robed judges and theologians, the imposing figure of Bishop Cauchon presiding, as she delivers her perfect theological rebuttal against the trap. The scene emphasizing the weaponization of medieval canon law against the lone, illiterate peasant girl, illuminated by a
grand 17th century classical oil painting portraying the scene at the Saint Ouen Cemetery on May 24, 1431. Joan, pale and trembling, signs the fabricated document on the public scaffold, while the executioner stands ominously by the stacked wood. The painting capturing the paralyzing fear and exhaustion that drove her to accept the legal trap, all rendered with rich, dark pigments and tragic realism, depicting this act of ecclesiastical prestidigitation that condemned her. Classical oil paintings. A haunting classical oil painting illustrating the cell 4 days after the abjuration. Joan stands in forbidden men's garments, having chosen physical safety over the deceitful promise of the law, facing the returning judges, Bishop Cauchon.
A wide-angle, classical oil painting depicting the somber march through the streets of Rouen on May 30, 1431. 800 English soldiers escort the condemned Joan, clad in a white shift and a damning paper mitre, her face resolute despite the humiliation. The cobblestone streets wet and reflecting the gray morning light. The oppressive medieval architecture towering over the scene of impending injustice, conveying a profound sense of inevitable tragedy. Classical oil paintings.
A highly dramatic classical oil painting, employing intense reds and blacks, depicting the moment Joan is consumed by the flames at the Place du Vieux Marché. She is chained brutally to the stake, her eyes fixed on the makeshift crucifix held aloft by Friar Loisler, her voice rising above the roar of the fire, crying, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," in a final powerful testament of faith, the smoke curling dramatically against the overcast sky, capturing the horror and the sanctity of the martyrdom. Classical oil paintings. A detailed classical oil painting featuring the cold, calculated expression of Bishop Pierre Cauchon, observing the burning of Joan of Arc from his elevated tribune, the firelight flickering menacingly across his face, symbolizing the ultimate corruption of the church and law for political ambition and English favor, capturing the intense moment of her final accusation, "Cauchon, I die by you," painted with severe realism and psychological depth.
The powerful classical oil painting contrasting Joan of Arc, the crowned warrior in shining armor from 1429, with Joan of Arc, the shackled prisoner in 1431, emphasizing the systematic dismantling of her identity. The scene should highlight the disappearance of her prophetic voice and military stature, replaced by the silence of the sow and the binding ropes tearing at her wrists, a metaphor for the destruction of hope using legal means, rendered in stark juxtaposition. Classical oil paintings. A poignant classical oil painting illustrating Joan's profound immediate regret after signing the abjuration and being returned to the military prison. She is depicted sitting alone, exhausted and dejected, the shame of having renounced her saints weighing heavily upon her. Realizing the terrifying, cruel sophistication of the legal trap designed to make her self-destruct, using muted colors and deep shadow to convey utter despair and spiritual isolation.
A dramatic classical oil painting depicting the interrogation where Joan faces the instruments of torture, the rack and estrapade, yet fearlessly asserts that any confession extracted would be declared null and void, challenging the authority of her inquisitors. The composition must highlight her unwavering resolve amidst the terrifying machinery of physical pain, showcasing the clarity of her legal logic against medieval brutality and coercion. Painted in the tenebrous style, classical oil paintings. A chilling classical oil painting capturing the final desperate act of suppression by the English authorities, the repetitive burning of Joan's remains at the stake until only fine gray ashes remain, followed by the calculated scattering of her pulverized relics into the swift currents of the Seine River, a determined effort to prevent her becoming a sacred relic and to erase her memory from history, rendered with cold.
A powerful classical oil painting, illustrating the rehabilitation trial 25 years later, focusing on the testimony of the surviving witnesses, judges, notaries, and guards, who, compelled by truth, reveal the meticulously fraudulent nature of the 1431 proceedings, exposing the entire process as a deliberate, systematic destruction of a human being, using the sophisticated machinery of medieval law as a weapon of state, capturing the solemn gravity of historical correction and ultimate vindication. Classical oil paintings. A devastating classical oil painting capturing the legal assassination of Joan of Arc in 1431.
Emphasize the profound dignity in her gaze as she holds the hastily constructed crucifix, her voice clearly crying, "Jesus," above the roar of the flames, contrasting sharply with the horrified realization dawning upon the hundreds of witnesses, including the English officials who now understand the immense historical and spiritual crime they have just committed. Classical oil paintings. A full-length portrait of the 19-year-old Joan of Arc, exhausted and pale, huddled in her military prison, signing the abjuration document on May 24, 1431, under the watchful, cruel gaze of Bishop Pierre Cauchon and armed English guards. The scene must capture the stark contrast between her spiritual resolution and physical terror, illustrating the legal perfidy that turned her desperate plea for life into the perfect trap for relapsed heresy, rendered with intense chiaroscuro and detailed fabric folds, evoking the dramatic tension of classical oil paintings.
A dramatic interior scene depicting Joan of Arc 4 days after her abjuration, standing vulnerable in the damp Rouen cell, reluctantly donning the forbidden male garments. The single source of light dramatically illuminates her shaved head and the fearful resolution in her eyes, highlighting the crushing choice between vulnerability to abuse in the woman's dress and legal execution for heresy, meticulously capturing the texture of the rough tunic and the cold stone walls in the style of classical oil paintings. A poignant half-body portrait of Joan of Arc in her prison cell, her head freshly shaven as an act of calculated humiliation, the rough hempen rope chafing her wrists. The composition must emphasize the indignity she suffers while retaining an inner defiant spirit, the cold air making her scalp tingle as she confronts her silent fate, rendered with deep, mournful shadows and rich, earthy tones characteristic of European classical oil paintings.
Focusing on the texture of her skin against the rough fabric. A sweeping courtroom drama capturing the relentless interrogation of Joan of Arc by 70 hostile pro-English theologians in Rouen, 1431. She stands isolated, intellectually parrying their complex theological traps, particularly the question of grace, her young face illuminated amidst the somber robed figures of the judges and scribes, the scene emphasizing the systemic cruelty of the legal process, executed with architectural precision and theatrical lighting, deeply reminiscent of classical oil paintings. A powerful allegorical depiction contrasting the triumphant Joan of Arc, clad in shining white armor beside King Charles VII at the Reims coronation in 1429, with her subsequent depiction as a chained prisoner in the Rouen fortress in 1431, symbolizing the rapid transition from divine mandate to legal weaponization.
The composition must use bright, heroic colors for the triumph and somber, dark tones for the incarceration, capturing the full scope of her dramatic arc in the elevated style of classical oil paintings. An expansive, panoramic view of the procession of Joan of Arc being escorted by 800 English soldiers through the packed streets of Rouen toward the Place du Vieux Marché on May 30th, 1431. She is visible, pale and resolute in a simple white shift, the looming sight of the pyre already dominating the horizon, capturing the palpable tension of the enormous crowd and the cold, unyielding faces of her English captors, depicted with the detailed realism and atmospheric perspective of classical oil paintings. The climactic scene at the stake, where Joan of Arc, bound tightly to the post, proudly gazes intently at the modest crucifix held high by Brother Nicolas Loiselaire amidst the rapidly rising flames and choking smoke, her final, repeated cry of "Jésus"
cuts through the chaos, her face a mask of spiritual focus overriding physical agony, rendered with the intense light and shadow and dramatic historical accuracy characteristic of classical oil paintings. A psychological portrait of Bishop Pierre Cauchon standing rigidly on the viewing scaffold at the Place du Vieux Marché, his ambitious and calculating gaze fixed upon the burning pyre of Joan of Arc. His expression is complex, reflecting both the political satisfaction of securing his position and the potential spiritual horror of having destroyed a purported saint through legal machinations, depicted with meticulous detail on his ecclesiastical robes and the dramatic use of light that isolates him from the observing throng, in the tradition of classical oil paintings.
A disturbing depiction of Joan of Arc confronted by the implements of medieval torture, the rack and the strappado, shown to her by the inquisitors in the grim fortress chamber, illustrating her stoic refusal to confess anything further, asserting that any forced statement would be retracted later. The scene emphasizes the dark metallic glint of the instruments and the psychological warfare employed against the unarmed 19-year-old, utilizing the dark palette and high drama common in classical oil paintings. An intricate allegorical composition illustrating the concept of Joan's destruction by legal mechanism, depicting her figure ensnared not by physical chains, but by vast binding scrolls of canon law and forged documents, with the menacing shadows of ecclesiastical judges looming large.
The painting should highlight the cold, elegant, và inescapable nature of the legal weapon used against her, utilizing symbolic elements và a rich, detailed texture to reflect the high conceptual drama of classical oil paintings. A chaotic but structured battle scene focusing on the pivotal moment of Joan of Arc's capture at Compiègne in 1430, showing her being unhorsed và surrounded by Burgundian forces. The composition must dramatically contrast the chaos of the skirmish và the cold calculation of her subsequent sale for £10,000 to the English, emphasizing the rich, bloody detail of medieval warfare và the flash of metal against the darkening sky, captured with the dynamic action and heroic focus typical of classical oil paintings.
A somber, desolate riverscape depicting the aftermath of the execution, where English executioners are seen casting the final ashes and remnants of Joan of Arc's pyre into the swirling waters of the Seine River, a calculated effort to prevent relics and eliminate her memory. The scene must evoke profound finality and historical cruelty under a cold, leaden sky, using muted, mournful tones and expansive scenery often found in detailed classical oil paintings. Depicting Joan of Arc, shorn and stripped of her protective armor, wearing the humiliating thin dress in the damp, claustrophobic stone cell in the Rouen military fortress, the scene emphasizing the palpable tension and fear induced by the surrounding silent English guards, highlighting the cold, calculated threat of legal relapse, render this moment of profound vulnerability in the dramatic chiaroscuro and rich, heavy texture of a 17th century classical oil paintings.
The harsh, dim light should catch the vulnerable curve of her neck and the rough fabric of her penitent's robe, contrasting sharply with the menacing shadows of the prison walls, symbolizing her imminent legal and physical destruction. A grand, crowded depiction of the public abjuration ceremony at the St. Owen Cemetery on May 24, 1431. Joan, though physically frail from months of interrogation, stands before Bishop Cauchin and a hostile multitude, the executioner and the towering, waiting pyre visibly dominating the background, while a manipulative notary urges her to sign the treacherous, fabricated document that seals her fate, all meticulously detailed and composed like a vast, solemn, historical, classical oil paintings. The faces of the clergy are rendered with cruel, calculating precision, capturing the exact moment the legal trap springs shut with ruthless, systemic efficiency.
Illustrate the pivotal, devastating moment inside the prison cell, where Joan, facing relentless threats of sexual assault, puts back on the prohibited men's hose and tunic, symbolizing her fatal relapse into heresy. Bishop Cauchin and his clerical assessors stand observing her from the doorway with cold, triumphant satisfaction, confirming the trap has worked perfectly,
rendered with the intense realism and dark psychological symbolism characteristic of a Dutch master classical oil paintings. The contrast between the simple, rough cloth of the prohibited garments and the monumental, destructive power of the religious law should be overwhelmingly emphasized.
A powerful, tragic depiction of Joan chained rigidly to the stake in the densely packed Rouen marketplace on the morning of her execution, surrounded by a horrified, silent crowd and 800 grim English soldiers. Flames are beginning to lick the dry wood, and her gaze is fixed intensely upward towards the crudely fashioned crucifix held aloft, her mouth open in the final, single, desperate cry of Jésus, captured in the intensely emotive, theatrical lighting and high drama of a Baroque classical oil paintings. The rising smoke partially obscures the faces of her official executioners, underscoring the impersonal, bureaucratic nature of her systemic murder.
Một complex, allegorical diptych composition juxtaposing Joan the crowned warrior, clad in shining armor at the coronation in Reims năm 1429, against Joan the Shorn, chained, defenseless prisoner in Rouen năm 1431 within a single frame, focusing on the systematic dismantling of her identity and divine mandate through the cunning legal process. The sharp lines of the victorious armor are visually fractured by the oppressive darkness of the courtroom and prison, stylized as a powerful, high-contrast romantic classical oil paintings. This visual narrative must forcefully embody the theme of medieval jurisprudence utilized as a coldly destructive weapon against human faith and truth.
Focus entirely on the figure of Bishop Pierre Cochon, the pro-English, ambitious cleric, surrounded by towering stacks of heavy legal parchment and theological texts in a dimly lit, austere study, meticulously planning the juridical destruction and framing of Joan of Arc. He is shown as the cold intellectual architect of the relapse trap, his face illuminated by a single calculating light source, styled after a somber, psychologically piercing Renaissance classical oil paintings. The oppressive atmosphere should convey the odor of corruption hidden beneath the guise of clerical authority and rigorous, weaponized legal process.
A close-up, intensely psychological portrait of Joan during one of the 70 grueling interrogation sessions, the emotional and physical toll of months of systemic harassment etched onto her face. She appears profoundly weary and isolated, her eyes deep-set, yet retaining a fierce, intelligent spark, as she manages to parry the most complex theological traps, presented with the detailed texture and moral intensity of a 16th century Italian classical oil paintings. The background should be a blurred wash of oppressive, anonymous faces of her judges, starkly emphasizing her utter isolation and the overwhelming, predetermined odds against her. An ethereal, symbolic representation of the intense internal conflict between Joan's divine voices, Saint Michael and Saint
Catherine, and the crushing, visible weight of the hostile legal court. She is depicted signing the abjuration document while ghostly, whispering figures loom behind her, expressing palpable betrayal and spiritual warning, stylized as a powerful, visionary history classical oil paintings. The scene must visually convey the immense, overwhelming spiritual and physical pressure used by the court to force her hand against her most sacred and defining faith. The scene must visually convey the immense, overwhelming spiritual and physical pressure used by the court to force her hand against her most sacred and defining faith. The focus is placed on the calculated, absolute effort to erase her physical existence and prevent any form of future veneration. A dramatic rendering of the pivotal moment in 1429, when Joan, in bright, divinely sanctioned armor, stands proudly beside the Dauphin Charles at his coronation in Reims Cathedral, symbolizing the sudden, miraculous rebirth of French national hope. Juxtaposed subtly with the ominous,